Hi, the second speaker at the 2024 Institute of Coaching Conference was Dr. Alisha Moreland-Capuia, who is from my hometown of Portland. If you get to see this, Alicia, hey, let's have coffee. She gave us an amazing talk about building trauma-informed organizations and people, why healing must be the way forward. And I am just so enthusiastically aligned with all that she shared in this talk. So I'm going to give you some of my notes and takeaways. First, I want to mention that Dr. Moreland Capuia wrote a book called The Trauma of Racism, The People and Systems Fear Built. I am excited to find that book. Excited. First, she introduced us to the concept and idea that won't be new to you, that safety is the first thing that we appraise in any new setting. Seeking, being, feeling safe. And it's something that everyone deserves to feel. Am I safe? Am I loved? Am I cared for? Then I can do my work. Then I can be productive. Then I can thrive. Then I can actually be creative. Call back to the creativity from Tomorrow Mind. I love this quote. She shared, "The work of a lifetime is regulating our emotions and considering others." I mean, those are things that are important to create a container, the causes and conditions of safety for everyone involved. Fear is a universal neurobiological response experience. Fear that never turns off or that doesn't turn off in a reasonable time frame is trauma. She showed us a slide. This is your brain on fear. It was fantastic. And then traumatization occurs when the resources, internally and externally, are not adequate to cope with the external threat. Reflection question: are our systems and organizations built on our greatest hopes and aspirations, or are they built from our greatest fears? I would say that we're built from our aspirations, but we act as if we're built from our greatest fears. Something to ponder and reflect on deeply, I think, for all people leading in organizations and building organizations. Next, Dr. Moreland Capuia shared isolation and sensory deprivation dysregulate our stress response. She shared a Gabor Mate quote that the opposite of addiction is connection. So instead of asking why is this person in addiction, we should be asking why the deep emotional pain that resulted in the addiction, why stress manifests sometimes as addiction. I loved this pearl too. We are designed to be interdependent, not independent, codependent, or fully dependent. So a little more on the trauma of exclusion. She asked us to imagine when we were kids playing kickball, being afraid that we weren't going to be picked for the team, right? Everybody was probably there at some point, or at least feared being there. So when we are excluded, or we simply have the internal story, the narrative, the perception that we're being excluded, 3 minutes of simulated experience resulted in negative affect that was detectable months later in an experiment where somebody had a simulated exclusionary. So everybody needs to belong. They want to belong and they need to matter. And that is why healing organizations and people in this way is critical and urgent. We talked about intergenerational, transgenerational trauma and healing. And I loved that she brought forward the concept that not only can trauma be passed on generationally, so can healing. These are we can create these new environments, memory markers in our DNA and RNA as part of our embodiment experience to move forward and to contribute our healing in the arc of our human history. Signs of suffering, SOS, my brain made it. Racism and phobias, transphobia, homophobia, xenophobia, these are all needless stress, trauma, and suffering. She called out an article I have not looked up yet, but I will mention it for you, an article about hate and countertransference, which sounds fascinating. And racism, consciously denied, but subconsciously applied. When she's explaining this to folks who have a question mark over their head, she says, have you ever had someone tell you that you were amazing, but they didn't treat you like it? It's like that. Love it so much. She talked about burnout and secondary trauma, which are always co-occurring. And I like this definition of occupational specific dysphoria as burnout. Burnout, occupational specific dysphoria, a protracted psychological and physical exhaustion as it relates to work. Here are some subpoints to that. 1, emptying the tank continuously is not sustainable. It makes completely logical sense, and having it framed in that succinct language is so good. And then she reached to these prolonged responses to chronic interpersonal stressors on the job. I love this list. Unresolved conflict, work overload, more to do than there is time or resources to do it, lack of control, aka autonomy, insufficient recognition or reward, including but not limited to financial reward, decisions that are perceived as fair and equitable versus unfair and unequitable, and when there is a values conflict on the job, so moral distress, you're being asked to do something outside of your moral boundary set. She also shared that secondary trauma presents a lot like PTSD. We have a lot of the same neurobiological responses. That was fascinating. And she shared with us a book by Lipsky named Trauma Stewardship that Dr. Moreland Capuia says is so important to her that she reads it every year. Trauma exposure changes us fundamentally. It sounds like this book is just super, super rich. And then we talked a bit about the science of compassion, how compassion is beneficial not only to the recipient, but especially to the giver of compassion, and that compassion increases vicarious optimism. She recommends that we find ways to brush up against joy at least daily. And I love this so much. Just so many beautiful one-line takeaways. She recommends in our orienting to healing from trauma in organizations and individuals that we reorient and reimagine, that we intentionally shift from transactional to relational. I think this is especially interesting because the transactional relational spectrum, especially in organizations, is a complex area where I think there's so much thinking and working and writing to do. Listening is a form of love. Success versus mastery. So this is having grace for our failures again. Success versus mastery. So success is hitting the arrow or the dart at the bullseye one time. That is success. But mastery is grouping, a tight grouping. So when you are able to hit near the mark repeatedly because you have practiced. Sometimes success is just a lucky shot, but when you have a mastery, there's more reliability in the system, and important that we do have grace for missing the mark. We have to have grace for missing the mark in trauma-informed spaces because we will. And we need to focus on the effort as well as the impact. She shared this concept of power circles, and it comes from 360s, where do you see yourself in relationship to the power source versus how do other people see you? Because oftentimes we are in leadership positions, even when we deny to ourselves that we're in leadership positions. So this is an interesting way to have a conversation about our localization of power in a less threatening way. Organizations like people can be traumatized. Organizations like people can heal. They can grieve. They can be treated as living things that need nurturing, not just machines. So I love that. And she left us with this question: what do you require to feel safe enough to do your job? That we can ask ourselves that, and that we can ask those that we are in connection with in work to start there. Start from at least, what do you feel you need in order to feel safe? And then take that information and do something with it, and then pay it forward and ask somebody else so that we have an ongoing ripple of how can I help you feel safe enough to do your job. Thank you, Dr. Alisha Moreland-Capuia, for this wisdom. We'll see you later.